Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Tuesday, October the 21st, and welcome to our Toronto Debating Society debate. Tonight's debate is a current affairs debate, and the topic is Canada should not be involved in military action against ISIS. So I'm going to call on the Prime Minister to define the motion and begin tonight's debate. Jerry, please.
Madam Speaker, members of the opposition, ladies and gentlemen. First, I will define the resolution as outlined by the Speaker. Then I will explain the main position of the government. And then I will give 4 arguments in favor of that position and of that resolution. By Canada, we mean the country. Should not is self-explanatory. By be involved, we mean participate in. By military action, we mean any form of air, naval, or ground combat by the Canadian military. And by against ISIS, we mean to destroy ISIS. There is no doubt in anybody's mind that the extremists who make up ISIS are fundamentally terrorists who threaten our very society, and that they must be stopped in their actions both in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. This government agrees with Mr. Harper to that degree. However, we do not feel that a direct military involvement by Canada is putting Canada's resources to the best use. That then is this government's position. We feel that there are far better uses of Canada's time, expertise, and finances than in taking part in the coalition of forces who are directly attacking the forces of ISIS. My first argument has to do with finances. Military actions cost huge amounts of money. During the last Iraqi war in the early 2000s, the projected cost by the Americans was $80 to $120 billion at the outset of the war. At the end, the final total was closer to $3 trillion. A projected cost for Canada's part in the airstrikes in this battle, which Canada will join shortly, with numbers supplied by the National Post, is $500 million. This projection, of course, could be many times that number when all is said and done. The Pentagon has said that airstrikes offer only a temporary effect, but are unlikely to affect militants significantly. A good example of that was reported by CNN, which said a truck with 2 terrorists in it had been destroyed by a missile at a cost of $500,000. A huge cost for a small gain. Ultimately, boots on the ground will be necessary to stop the ISIS forces. When this occurs, the cost per year to finance the war will rise from 15 to 20 billion currently to an astronomical figure. The small percentage of Canada's contribution to this total effort, which is in the order of 2 to 3%, can be put to much better use. Rather than taking part for show in this coalition and contributing our 6 aging CF-18s to the cause, Canada could use these finances for purposes for which Canada is well known. My partner will speak further on this matter. My second argument then points to where our efforts abroad should be focused. Marc Garneau, the Liberal Party critic, said that his party believes that Canada's best efforts should be devoted to humanitarian efforts in helping Iraqis and Syrians forced from their homes by ISIS. An article by the BBC stated that some Syrians have been forced to sell their daughters as child brides in order to save their families. People in war zones are desperate, and this is where Canada can make a huge difference in the region. Our historical expertise and capacity in dealing with displaced persons should be a main aim in this conflict, rather than just adding to the list of combatants simply to prove we can. Both Justin Trudeau and Tom Mulcair have stated that their parties believe this type of humanitarian involvement is what Canada should pursue, instead of the role chosen by Mr. Harper. Mr. Garneau also says that Canada could offer aid in strategic airlifts, training, and medical support, all of which are desperately needed in the region. My third argument concerns Canada's reputation. Canada has built up a very positive reputation in dealing with refugees in the past, from the Vietnamese boat people to the Ismailis from Uganda, and most recently with the Tamils. If we veer away from these types of efforts and instead take part in active combat, Canada's character will be changed in the eyes of the world. My partner will speak more on the subject of refugees. My fourth and final argument has to do with restricting access to financial resources. An institution called FinTrack, Financial Tracking, is a Canadian financial agency which is actively tracking money related to ISIS. One of their main aims is to study and ultimately put a stop to the cash flow from countries like Canada, which ends up financing ISIS. They look for links between radicalized Canadians and terrorists abroad, and then work with the RCMP to sever those links. They also track big money transfers from country to country. Since 2008, as reported by the CBC News, there has been a 450% increase in disclosures related to terrorist financing due to the work of FinTrack. Greater funding for FinTrack and a broadening of their scope would put even greater pressure on this flow of cash to the Middle East. This is where some of that money could be put, in helping to stop the flow of money to the Middle East to finance ISIS. Please join with us to ensure that people in the region of war do not get overlooked and forgotten in the rush to eradicate ISIS. Vote with us in favor of this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. I would now like to call on the Leader of the Opposition, Heather, to rebut this motion and to put forward her own arguments.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the government. Myself and my colleague in the opposition are here to put a stop to the resolution and debate proposed by the government that Canada should not provide any military action against ISIS. Ladies and gentlemen, my Honourable Prime Minister here, the Honourable Prime Minister mentioned that there were 3 main points he was going to discuss, and then he went on to talk about 4. We had time, expertise, and finances, and then we talk about refugees. First, I'd like to do a quick rebuttal on these points and make up for lost time. Basically, the Prime Minister quoted one of the Liberal members of government talking about the humanitarian efforts needed to help displaced Syrians. First, I'd like to point out that the leader of his party, Justin Trudeau, has failed to make any substantial case for not going to war, and in fact initially supported going to war against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and has now kind of waffled on that. 2 of the stalwart party members, Lloyd Axworthy and Bob Rae, have both supported military action in Iraq, and here's why, and Syria. Here's why, because you simply cannot deliver and administer humanitarian aid to a people under siege. There are mass abductions. There are beheadings on a daily basis. Thousands and thousands of people are being killed. Humanitarian aid sent to dead people has no bearing whatsoever.
Does this include the 3.17 million Syrian refugees who are currently living in neighboring countries?
Yes, well that brings to another point, is that perhaps our resources are better spent helping these refugees, is what the Prime Minister had suggested. 3.1 million refugees are living in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and various areas around there. Canada so far has failed to bring in more than a few hundred or a couple of thousands of these refugees. Over 3 million refugees. If we invited them to come and live in Canada and took that route to support the refugees who have been displaced or paid for their housing costs back in their hometowns? At what cost would that be, and for what? They cannot go back with this horrible, hideous, tyrannical group running their countries. ISIS has a huge swath of land in western Iraq and in eastern Syria, and they are sitting on some of the world's largest oil reserves. They have a cash flow coming out of the ground that cannot be stopped by FinTrack, that cannot be stopped by hunting down elusive people on the internet using fake IP addresses, sending stipends to terrorists. The most effective way we can combat this problem, and it's a problem that's in our own backyard, is to actually engage in active military combat. And the government said, what about Canada's reputation? I would ask the government, the Prime Minister, has he ever heard from the ladies from hell? In the Second World War, Canada had a reputation, and that was changing the course of the outcome of that war, because our fighters went over there and we supplied the military support needed to turn the tide. Which brings me to my argument as to why we need to provide military support. Many of you have probably heard the expression, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. Well, it's not clear who first said this quote, but I think what is clear is the universal truth that it contains. The government proposes Canada should not be involved in military action against ISIS, that there are better alternatives than going to war, such as the humanitarian aid, trying to stop the cash flow in there. They did not talk about recruitment. They basically believe that alternative approaches are preferable to engaging in combat, that we should shy away from war, that it will cost us too much. Well, yes, there will be a cost. But do we pay that cost now, or do we pay a premium later? Because this group is something of the likes of which we have never seen. Imagine if we took this posture against the Nazis during the Second World War. Imagine the outcome if Canadians did not make necessary sacrifices with their wallets and with their lives to fight against the Nazis. Canada did not allow evil to triumph then, and we should not allow evil to triumph now. Today there is the regime of ISIS, which is a new Nazi-like regime. ISIS is run by extremists who are using the same playbook as Hitler. Instead of an Aryan nation, they want an Islamic caliphate that most Muslim groups, in fact, all major Islamic organizations are against. They refer to these guys as imposters. They will not stop at the Iraqi-Syrian borders. And in fact, we had evidence today or yesterday in Canada that they are in our own backyard. As leader of the opposition, I would like to outline three main reasons why Canada must provide military support against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and why we have a legal and moral obligation to degrade and defeat this army of angry young men, because that's what they are. And some of them are the renegades that are being deployed right here at home. First and foremost, the federal government has a legal obligation to protect Canadians and defend its citizens against anyone who would do them harm. If you think this is a war being fought only in Syria and Iraq, think again. ISIS is a public safety concern and a national security threat. Young Canadians are being recruited, radicalized, and trained over the internet. Social media has sent conventional warfare and national borders the way of the dodo bird. The threats posed by ISIS are real, and they're here. More and more Canadians have joined the ranks of the jihadist group to become foreign fighters. As many as 80 have returned home. That's not about money. That's about cold, hard facts on the ground and a threat to our personal safety and security. Secondly, as soon as Canada signed on to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, we committed to an obligation of collective defense. Right now, ISIS is wrestling for control of a Syrian town called Kobani that is a stone's throw from the border with Turkey. It's a 10-minute walk from the center of town. Turkey is a member of NATO. The fight for Kobani puts this fight at NATO's southern border. We are obligated to act, and active in active combat. Third, Canada has a moral obligation to defend human rights. ISIS uses barbaric tactics. It uses genocide, public beheadings, public stonings, mass murder, mass kidnapping, forced conversion, using rape as a weapon of war. Similar methods were employed by the Taliban in Afghanistan until the US launched a war. Canada did not hesitate to provide military support to our ally in that effort to oust the Taliban. And it worked. And because they got rid of the Taliban, only then were they able to pave the way for the next steps in providing long-term solutions, such as humanitarian aid, parliamentary democracy, centralized government services, and importantly, universal education for girls, which is one thing ISIS is also against. The United Nations is an international coalition and an international coalition of 20 countries support military force against ISIS. You want to talk about our reputation? Which side are we going to be on? Are we going to be on the side of this coalition, which, by the way, includes Sunni Muslim countries who are fighting against these ISIS fighters? Sorry, is that the 1 minute warning?
No, it's 7 minute warning.
That's a 7 minute warning. Okay, well, that's it for me then.
Thank you very much, Heather. I would now like to call on Jim, who will back up the arguments put forward by the Prime Minister and rebut the arguments of the opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will start. I brought my own. Ladies and gentlemen, the Leader of the Opposition has highlighted the warmongering aspects of what Canada she would like to live in. I'd like to bring up some of the points that she made, which are just off of the reality. For example, she was saying that oil in the area that ISIS has taken over is providing them with funds. Actually, the oil wells have been bombed now. That was one of the first things that Obama did. The oil wells are pretty much taken out, and they don't have revenue from there anymore. Good. You've got to sit down until it's 1 minute, madam.
Oh.
She also used this quote, "Good men do nothing, then whatever it was." Maybe you can answer that. The point is, we are not projecting that we should do nothing. We are saying that Canada should use the funds that are being used to buy armaments, as the Prime Minister pointed out, at $500,000 each for humanitarian aid.
Point of opposition?
In a second. I'll take it in a second. She also pointed out as one of her arguments that NATO, belonging to NATO means that if you're attacked, then you're obliged to take part in any military action against the attacker of the country that's being attacked. Well, so far, Turkey is not being attacked. It is on the border, and ISIS has not taken part in any military action against Turkey. Iraq and Syria are not part of NATO, and so therefore the Canadian aspect or the NATO aspect does not hold true in this situation. Yes, madam.
Yes, I would like to question your assertion that Obama has taken out all the oil wells. What the U.S. targeted strikes did was they took out the oil wells
Can you make
in
it brief,
Syria.
please?
Pardon me?
Can you make it brief?
Yes, that accounts for $1 to $2 million a day. Would the member of the government please explain what's happening in Mosul, which is the oil-rich region, the oil center of the region, and it has not been taken out in terms of oil.
Can I get that? Can I get that time back later? Yes. What actually happened was that Obama, the very first thing he did was to bomb the oil wells, to take out the stream of revenue that is coming from oil wells, typically in Syria. And I believe in Mosul, the people there have fought back. Now, I would like to get on to the main points. I have 2 points to get into, but I would like to reiterate what the Prime Minister has said earlier, and remind you that Canada has a proud history in combat. It worked in Afghanistan, not, as the Leader of the Opposition pointed out, failed to point out, to much great effect. Blood and treasure was expended there, and not a great deal was actually achieved at the end of the 10 years or 12 years of action. But Canada also has a proud history of peacekeeping and humanitarian causes. And this is what we think on the government is what Canada should be doing now. Not throwing a few bombs at ISIS, which is all well and good. Believe me, we do not downplay the need for military action. However, we do encourage you here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, to think of the men and women, the refugees who are out there who are suffering because of this activity, and to bring to you the problems that are visited upon the refugees. Now, I don't have much time left because of the Leader of the Opposition's extensive question, but let me bring up the role of Canada's 6 CF-18s. There are 1983 models, and there are 6 of them. and their ability in any kind of smart war is extremely limited. Their actual combat radius is 537 kilometers, and if you look at the map, it's actually over 1,200 kilometers to the area of bombing. So obviously there's extra cost involved there. They're great for Soviet incursions on Canadian airspace, but they are not great for being part of a war against ISIS because they're not very smart. If you want to do that, then use Tomahawk missiles, armed drones, and stealth bombers, which the US has in excess, and Canada does not. I have very little time to explain what the story is with the refugees, but put it this way, the World Food Program is $352 million in shortfall, and it just so happens that $500 million would nicely fill that gap. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I've run out of time, but we urge you to vote for the motion this evening. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Jim. I would now like to call on the member of the opposition, Adrian, to come up and put some additional arguments for the opposition.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The motion we have for you tonight is that Canada should not be involved in military action against ISIS. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide some rebuttals on the government, and then I'm going to introduce some new arguments. So what happened here is, Jim was talking about warmongering, but this is a reality thing. Oil do provide funds, and it is important. Half a totalitarian for humanitarianism he was talking about, and humanitarian aid, and how that's important. But when you have a situation like this, it's better to first go in there, intervene, diffuse the situation, and then after you diffused it and you stop the ISIS people, and then you can get humanitarian aid, is a better approach, because you can't just negotiate with terrorists. You can't just work out with them like that. You have to fight back. You have to have military intervention. There is just no way that you cannot do that, is what I believe. Peacekeeping is not enough. He talks about NATO. Well, Turkey was kind of part of that. Canada does have a history in combating, which does kind of show some of that too. I'll just quickly get to my main arguments. I believe that many Canadians connections already with this. There were some Calgary men who were part of it. He talked about if you can kill a believing American or European, especially spiteful French or Australian or Canadian. And so he's the lead of ISIS, so there's a real threat there. There was talks about a gun and knife attack happening in a public place. There are, as I said, there are also many economic impacts. So what there is you have Canada and the U.S., they're trading partners. It can have a real effect on it. It can have a serious effect on oil prices as a thing. As a result of this, you also cannot put a price at all on the cost of lives and the well-being of Canada, because if you allow them to go on, they're going to try to be attacked. They are going to, yes.
What about the cost of lives of the millions of people who have already been displaced and who are in surrounding countries, the refugees?
Yeah, it is very important to look after that and to provide help for that too, because of it. But just that alone is not going to be enough, because these beheadings are going to go on. There's going to be a lot of incidents, and you have to control the people who did it. You can't just not allow them to control the people. That is what happens here. And so, as I said, there's also, a short-term cost for this, but in the end, there is a long-term cost to how this will affect us and our well-being, and it will be a more positive experience and a more positive thing if we intervene and we go through this thing, because it really does help the country more if there's a military intervention, as I said, and there was no real need for just humanitarian aid, as I said. Jim?
Yes, you say there's no real need for humanitarian.
There is
aid.
aid. There is aid for it. That's it. There is
There
need
is.
for it. But I do think that there's got to be military intervention too, because you can't just stop the terrorists. You can't stop beheading. You can't have that too. Also too, there are many countries already involved. The U.S., the U.K., Australia, Saudi Arabia. They have all gotten into it. They have all been supporting and involved, and we should involve them too. The United Nations themselves lately has been talking about intervening too, not just humanitarian aid themselves. So this concludes my statement. Please vote against the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. We're now going to move on to the summations. There'll be no new arguments in the summations, and I would like to call on Heather to start the summation. Thank you,
Hold on a sec. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, the government would have us believe that to make an analogy here, that if Ebola came to our doors, it would be better to give up on the plight to develop a vaccine and sit and hold the hand of the dying. If we do not destroy this group, ISIS, in Syria and Iraq, the humanitarian crisis will be tenfold. We have to kill them first. By them, I mean the group. Last month, the leader of ISIS released an audio recording. Here's some of what he said. "You will not feel secure even in your bedrooms. We will strike you in your homeland. You will never be able to do harm to anyone afterwards." Yesterday, a radicalized young man in Quebec killed a Canadian soldier and injured another during a hit and run. It was intentional. He was armed with a knife. He'd never been to Syria or Iraq because the government had confiscated his passport. The head of the RCMP confirmed he was one of 90 individuals who was identified as a national security risk and being actively investigated. I would say, ladies and gentlemen, for the armed group in ISIS right now, do we fight them with tents and humanitarian aid, or do we whip out our CF-18s? Because when it comes to a scimitar versus a tent, the scimitar wins. And even though we have an aging fleet of CF-18s and a few refueling planes and a few soldiers over there, it will beat the scimitar. So I ask you, if we look at history and the contribution Canada has made in pivotal moments in our history, do we want to follow in the footsteps of Neville Chamberlain, as he did in the Second World War, or do we want to follow in the footsteps of Winston Churchill? Yes, there is a cost to war, but do we stop the hemorrhaging now and treat the symptoms later, or do we let this situation bleed to death and bleed us out in our own country? Ladies and gentlemen, I would urge you to support, or to not support the government's motion that Canada does need, indeed, to send military combat forces into Syria and Iraq. We need to do it now. We need to have clear objectives, and only then can we focus on the alternative methods of humanitarian aid and trying to help the refugees over there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather. Now I would like to call on Jerry to put together the summation on behalf of the government.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I have no new information here. There is still no doubt in our minds, or in fact in most people's minds, that the forces of ISIS are terrorists who threaten our society, that they must be stopped. However, in our minds, the good that Canada could do by being part of an offensive military action is far outweighed by the good Canadians could do in a humanitarian action in the war region. My partner has shown that Canada's part in a war effort would be both very limited and extremely expensive for the small difference that we could make in attacking the forces of ISIS. Adding our outdated equipment to the combined forces of the many countries involved in attacking ISIS is certainly not the way Canada should take part in this struggle. Someone has to take care of the innocent victims who are hanging on by a thread to life during this chaotic time. He has also shown that the funds which could have gone to an offensive effort would be far better spent in improving the fragile lives of these displaced Syrians and Iraqis. Both Canada's reputation and expertise in the subject of refugees will serve to make considerable contributions and make a real difference to people who are desperate and on the edge of survival.
Hear, hear.
Better to save them than have more body bags on the highway of heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, join with us. Speak up as Canadians have done throughout history. Let us put our efforts into caring for the people in this war-torn area. Please support the motion.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, debaters. That ends the formal part of our debate. I would like to now call upon our adjudicator to give the formal assessment of the debate and tell us who the winner of the debate is and the best speaker. Dean.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, members of the government and the opposition, Canada should not be involved in military action against ISIS is tonight's rather sobering topic, but we saw tonight a very spirited debate. And given that it's a current affairs debate and that the participants only had since Friday to get their act together, so to speak, I think it was very well researched, very well argued, and very well presented as well. So I will get into the meat and potatoes of the actual debate. Jerry, as the Prime Minister, came up and he said, I'm going to give you 4 arguments. So I was already with the 4 arguments set to go, and I had them down. Basically, why Canada should not be involved. Resources are not put to best use in terms of time, finances, armed forces, and refugees. That there was a time issue as well in terms of being currently involved. And so the points that were made by the government, firstly, was the issue of finances, how much it was going to cost and how much had been spent in the Iraq war in the billions of dollars and what was forecast for this and what Canada's proposed cost would be. And the Prime Minister was very good about citing sources. So he had the National Post, he had CBC, all these different sources that he had picked up on. So it was good to see that he had done his research, CNN as well, to do that. In terms of the content for that, the opposition came back and argued, kept it going. So this point was a strong point for everybody. They'd done their research about the financial costs as far as what it was going to cost Canada money-wise and also in terms of armed forces. The opposition brought up as well what would have happened if we had done this with the Nazis, if we had waited, as you're suggesting, we shouldn't do this and go in right away. Canada did that. And so that lingering question comes up in your head, and as a person listening, you go, oh, that's a good point, thinking about that. But the government's points were also, in terms of content, saying we should do humanitarian aid. That's more important right now. And our reputation as Canadians is well known for that. So, in addition, according to FinTrack, there are ways to deal with ISIS financially as opposed to militarily. We don't have to rush in to do that. We can actually help control them financially. So that's an option for people to use. So the opposition countered with that, and so the opposition came back against all of those arguments, although with the reputations, I heard about the ladies from hell from World War II, and I heard nothing else. And so I don't know who the ladies from hell were, or what they did, or why it was fantastic that they did something in World War II, which is unfortunate. And that whole reputation of Canada got dropped after it was raised by the government at the beginning of that. The opposition came up with a couple of other points, though, in terms of content and arguments. The government must protect their citizens. There's a risk to us here in Canada. We're members of NATO, and we have been. The threats are there, that the Taliban, likewise, ISIS, is beheadings, rapes, and just dealing with utter chaos. So those were points that were brought up as well. The government came back and did deal with the question of NATO and saying, well, Turkey's not a member, and Iraq and Syria, Turkey's not under attack, and Iraq and Syria are not members, so it's sort of a false argument that you're making that way to counter that. So that cut that argument pretty much out. The other issue, again, going with where to put the effort. With humanitarian aid, opposition's arguments generally was, we need to bring peace first, then we can help the people. And it was hard for the government to argue against that. You can sort of argue it in your head, but the opposition did keep hammering on that point and saying, you can't just negotiate with the terrorists, you've got to fight them first, then you deal with it there. So I felt for you, and the World Food Program money that could have been spent, that was also brought in by the Prime Minister at the end as a summation point, was well used to say, look, use the money that you could be spending on these armed forces to help the people. So there was rebuttal that way against the opposition's points of saying, well, we should just fight them. And saying, well, again, with the FinTrack and with the humanitarian aid and helping the Syrians, helping the people in Turkey, all these other people who are suffering, that is more in line with what Canada is known for. The member of opposition and the leader and the member of government supported their leaders. The cost of lives in Canada if they're attacked, countered by the government saying, well, what about the millions of people dying overseas? The issue about the oil reserves, that was a possible thing. They're being fought. Well, now they've been bombed, says the government. So there's not an issue. And that was sort of dropped by the opposition. So the government was arguing again strongly, saying, look, Canada's sort of the Boy Scout, and we're better at humanitarian aid. We're also realistically 6 CF-18s, not going to work. They don't go that far. Compared to the Tomahawk missiles of the US, much better versed as a country to do it that way. So arguments being made on the government that, again, financially, not in the best interests of the people who are suffering from ISIS, not in Canadians' reputation, and not agreed to by the politicians as well. Senator Garneau talking about that. Justin Trudeau brought it back and forth, so it was talked about. Two quick references as well. A reference to Justin Trudeau. Do we just whip out our CF-18s? I believe that was his quote from earlier this month. And from in the summation as well for the Prime Minister, better than to have more body bags on a highway of heroes. Right? That was a good image that sort of ended off the debate for me. So 2 points of information were brought up. Were well addressed, 3 points. Government seconder to the leader of opposition, I will wind up very quickly, in terms of better spent money for the refugees. I took points off for the leader of the opposition for the very long-winded question, and gave a few points back to the government for the time that they lost on that. So, all in all, a strong debate from both sides, good arguments from both sides, good content from both sides, as well as rebuttals and points of information. In the end, the government has won it, 72 to 58, and the best speaker this evening is Jerry. I will hand it back to the speaker.
And now the results of the popular vote, in an unusual situation, actually agree with the adjudicator. It's the government 10 and the opposition 5. So, Jerry. Congratulations.